Let's now start with step 12, which is actually the second step for Spring MVC. In this step, we would want to configure our first Spring MVC controller. What we'll do after this step is we would take a break and understand the concept of dispatcher servlet, the component scan, and the controllers in detail. First, let's configure a very simple Spring MVC controller. So let's get started with creating a Spring MVC controller. What we want to create is something called a login controller, which responds to a URL /login. So how do we create that? That's basically what we want to do during this particular step. So I'll start with right click, new class, and I would want to call this login controller. And the package I would want to put in it, I don't want to put it in the JEE package, but I would want to put it in a different package, Spring MVC. I would have the login controller class created right now. We have a class login controller created. Now I would want to tell Spring that this is a controller. How do I tell Spring that this is a controller? In a servlet, we used to extend the HTTP servlet. But in Spring, you would not need to extend anything. All that you need to do is add an annotation. The annotation is at controller. So the at controller annotation would tell Spring that this is a controller. This would handle web requests. Inside the controller, you can add in methods to handle the web requests. As this is the first thing that you are creating with Spring MVC, let's keep it very simple. All that we will send back is a text message called hello world. So what we will do is let's create a simple method. So public string say hello. This is any Java method. There's nothing specific about this. So this method is returning hello world back. That's it. So now we have a simple method which is returning hello world back. What we want to do, however, is that whenever user types in /login in the URL, so the URL when we are using Spring is localhost :8080/Spring MVC. This takes us to the dispatcher servlet. To get to the controller, what we want to type in is login. So the URL we want to use is localhost 8080 Spring MVC and login. So we want to have this controller exposed at the URL /login. How do we assign a URL to this particular method? The way we can do that is by using another annotation called request. So we are mapping a request to this. The way we map the URL is just say value is equal to /login. That's it. So now you're mapping this URL /login to this particular method. So let's now go and run the application. There's a small error that we'll face, but let's see it live. Let's type in the URL localhost :8080/Spring MVC/login. You see that we are getting an error. If you want to understand what's happening in the background as we were doing in the earlier steps, you can do a right click, inspect element, and get to the network tab and do a refresh. You can see that we are sending a get request. So when we talk about the requests, there are importantly two kinds of requests. There are other types, but most prominently used ones are get and post. Here, when we type something in the URL and press enter, what we are sending is a get request. And the get request, we are sending it to a URL called login. So if you look at it, the URL is localhost 8080 Spring MVC/login. The response status is 404. 404 is usually page not found. So that's the status code of the response. So we are sending a request, and the response which is coming back is basically saying an error. The error and the content of the page that we are seeing in here. The status of the response is 404. So this is how typically web applications work, right? You send a request and you get a response back. The response that we are getting back right now has a status 404, which indicates it's an error. Now we need to debug why this error is coming. So I'll go into the log, into the console, and you see that there's an error. So it's saying no mapping found for slash spring MVC slash hello world. So we are returning hello world here, and spring MVC is searching for this particular URL, searching for a mapping for this particular URL. That's how spring MVC works by default. So let's take a minute and let's think about what's happening in the background. What we have is a dispatcher servlet and a login controller. We typed in this URL in the browser. The first thing is actually what maps to the dispatcher servlet. You would have seen already this in the web.xml. So in the web.xml, what we have done is we said anything that starts with spring MVC. So that's basically the way we said it. So spring MVC slash star. So anything that maps starts with spring MVC, send it to the dispatcher servlet. So anything that you type in with a URL starting with spring MVC, so like what we are doing in here, it will go to whom? It will go to the dispatcher servlet. What we said in the login controller is we are defining slash login as the URL for login controller. So when the dispatcher servlet gets this request, it sees that it's slash login. So dispatcher servlet sees it's slash login, and the dispatcher servlet knows that slash login is handled by whom? Login controller. So now login controller is called. Login controller is, the method is going to login controller, and login controller is returning hello world. So hello world is returned back to the dispatcher servlet. So dispatcher gets this hello world back, and now with this hello world it doesn't know anything. What we wanted to happen was we wanted it to be shown on the screen. But what dispatcher servlet is doing is searching for something else with the name hello world. So how do we make the dispatcher servlet, instead of searching for a URL or a view with the name hello world, to return that as a text? There is another thing called response body. So we need to add a annotation called response body. This annotation will make spring MVC, the dispatcher servlet, think that whatever response is written back is not the name of a view, it's not the name of a URL, it's not anything but actually the response that we want to send back. So when I said at response body, this would be sent back as response. Let's see what would happen now. So I'm refreshing this page again. You would see hello world. Now the status is 200, so that's good. So 200 is a successful response. So the request is successful, so the response status is 200. That's very good. So request URL is this. The method is get, because we are typing it in the URL. We'll look at post requests a little later. 200 is the status code, and if you look at the response is what we are getting back. So whatever we send back in here, hello world, dummy, or whatever, is coming back in the response. So let's wait for the Spring server to load up. I mean, one important thing you would have already noted is whenever I make a change, the server automatically loads it. So we typically wait for this message to come back after making the change, and then we are ready to launch the whole thing up. So now I'm ready. So hello world, dummy. So, and that's exactly what's in the response as well. So basically in this step, what we have done is we have created a simple controller. So in Spring MVC, what we are seeing is all requests, because we configured the dispatcher servlet as the one to receive all the requests. All requests first go to the dispatcher servlet, and the dispatcher servlet based on the URL. So here it's /login, and then it finds the login controller. Let's try something in here. So let's try something. Let's play with something which is not there. So login 5. Is login 5 defined? No, we only defined /login. So what would happen? You get a 4 of 4, and if you go and search, so this is the message from the dispatcher servlet which says no mapping for this URL in dispatcher servlet. What is happening is, because it's /spring MVC, it goes to dispatcher servlet. Then dispatcher servlet looks for something for login 5. It does not find anything. So it returns back an error. So that's basically how the requests work in Spring MVC. Everything goes through dispatcher servlet. So it goes to the dispatcher servlet looks at the controllers and tries to find the appropriate controller. The controller returns the result back to it, and based on the result, the dispatcher servlet would either redirect it to another view or another controller, or if there is a response body annotation, it directly returns that as the response back to the browser. That's a quick overview of how to create your first controller with Spring MVC.